The Last Breath. Chapter 1. The Oath. Dr. Julian Winters stood by the window of his private office, gazing out at the sprawling cityscape. The lights twinkled like stars in the night, but they brought him no comfort. The weight of the day's responsibilities pressed down on his shoulders, and he could feel the tension building in his chest. Medicine was his calling, his passion, but lately, it had become something else, something darker. A sharp knock on the door broke his reverie. Julian turned, frowning as he saw a man in a dark suit step inside without waiting for an invitation. The stranger's face was shadowed, but Julian could see the glint of something cold and calculating in his eyes. "Dr. Winters," the man began, his voice smooth as silk, "I have a proposition for you." Julian's instincts screamed at him to throw the man out, but something in the stranger's demeanor made him pause. "Who are you?" Julian asked, keeping his voice steady. The man smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "My name is not important. What matters is the opportunity I'm about to offer you." He stepped closer, pulling a thick envelope from his coat pocket and placing it on Julian's desk. "Inside you'll find a list of names, patients of yours I believe, wealthy, influential individuals." Julian's heart began to race as he stared at the envelope. "What do you want from me?" he asked, already fearing the answer. The man's smile widened. "It's simple, really. I want you to make sure that these patients of yours don't recover. An unfortunate complication during surgery, a misdiagnosed condition. It's all within your power, Dr. Winters. And for each name on that list, you'll be handsomely rewarded." Julian felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "You're asking me to kill my patients," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The man's eyes glittered. "I'm asking you to ensure your future. The people on that list, let's just say the world would be better off without them. And if you refuse, well, accidents happen even to the most skilled surgeons." Julian's mind raced. He had taken an oath to do no harm, but this man was threatening everything he held dear. His career, his life, the lives of his loved ones, everything was at stake. The man leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Think carefully, Dr. Winters. One way or another, you will make a decision. I suggest you make the right one." Without another word, the man turned and walked out, leaving Julian alone with the envelope. His hands trembled as he reached for it, dread pooling in his stomach. He knew that whatever choice he made, nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 2. The List. The envelope felt heavy in Julian's hands, as if the paper itself carried the weight of the sins it demanded. He hesitated, the urge to toss it into the trash overpowering. But he knew that this was not something he could ignore. He was already entangled, whether he liked it or not. He slid a finger under the flap and pulled out a neatly typed sheet of paper. The names stared back at him, each one a patient he had treated, some he had even come to know personally. They were more than just names, they were lives he had sworn to protect. His gaze moved down the list, stopping at the last name. It was a name he recognized all too well, Emma Lockhart, a longtime patient and close friend. She was a philanthropist, known for her charitable work and dedication to improving the community. The idea of harming her was unthinkable. Julian's breath quickened as the enormity of the situation sank in. How had he gotten to this point? He was a doctor, not a murderer. Yet, the shadowy figure's threats lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of the peril he faced. A soft knock on the door startled him, and he hastily shoved the paper back into the envelope. "Come in," he called, trying to keep his voice steady. Nurse Kelly stepped inside, her expression one of concern. "Dr. Winters, are you okay? You look pale." Julian forced a smile. "I'm fine, Kelly. Just a lot on my mind." She nodded, but her worry didn't fade. "If you need anything, just let me know." "Thank you," Julian replied, watching as she left the room. Her concern was genuine, but he couldn't confide in her, or anyone for that matter. The less people knew, the safer they would be. He sat down heavily in his chair, his thoughts a tangled mess. He had to find a way out of this nightmare, but how? Reporting the man to the authorities was an option, but there were no guarantees they could protect him or those he cared about. And if the man was as powerful as he seemed, any misstep could cost Julian his life. The sound of his phone vibrating on the desk jolted him from his thoughts. He picked it up, seeing an unknown number on the screen. Hesitating for only a moment, he answered. "Dr. Winters," the familiar voice purred, sending a chill down Julian's spine. "I trust you've had time to consider my offer?" Julian swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I can't do what you're asking," he said, his voice trembling despite his efforts to stay calm. There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "Oh, but you will, Dr. Winters. You see, I have a vested interest in ensuring that you do. Perhaps a demonstration is in order, just to show you what's at stake." Julian's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "Turn on your television," the man instructed, his tone eerily calm. Julian's hand shook as he grabbed the remote and switched on the TV. The news channel flickered to life, and he felt the blood drain from his face as he saw a familiar building engulfed in flames. It was the office of one of the names on the list, a patient who had just undergone surgery that very morning. The voice on the phone was laced with satisfaction. "I suggest you make your decision quickly, Dr. Winters, before someone else has an unfortunate accident." The line went dead, leaving Julian staring at the inferno on the screen, his mind a whirl of fear and desperation. The man was serious, deadly serious. And now Julian knew that any wrong move could result in more lives being lost. He was trapped in a web of blackmail and deceit with no way out. But as the flames danced in the reflection of his eyes, Julian vowed to find a way to beat the man at his own game. He just had to figure out how. Chapter 3. The first move. Julian spent the night in a restless haze, thoughts of the burning building replaying in his mind. He knew that the man was watching his every move, ready to strike at the slightest hint of disobedience. The pressure was unbearable, yet Julian couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something. Some piece of the puzzle that could help him outmaneuver his tormentor. Morning light streamed through the blinds as Julian finally rose from his chair, having barely slept. He needed to be in the operating room in less than an hour, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He couldn't let his patients down, yet he also couldn't ignore the threat looming over him. Somehow he had to balance the two. As he prepared for the day, Julian resolved to act as though nothing was wrong. He would play along for now, giving the impression that he was complying with the demands while secretly seeking a way to bring his blackmailer to justice. But first he needed to understand who he was dealing with. At the hospital, Julian moved through his rounds with a forced calmness. Each patient he visited, each chart he reviewed, felt like a step closer to the edge of a precipice. He could feel the eyes on him, the unseen presence of the man who had turned his life upside down. It was during his lunch break that Julian made his first move. He slipped away to a secluded corner of the hospital's courtyard, pulling out his phone. He couldn't risk using the hospital's internet, knowing it was likely monitored, so he opted for an encrypted messaging app. His fingers hovered over the screen as he typed out a message to an old college friend, someone who had taken a different path after medical school, into the world of private security and investigations. If anyone could help Julian navigate this nightmare, it was him. "Need your help. Urgent. Can't explain over text. Meet me tonight, 8 p.m. at the old coffee shop. Come alone." He hit send and stared at the phone, willing a response to appear. Time ticked by slowly, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, a reply flashed on the screen. "I'll be there. Stay safe." Relief washed over Julian, but it was quickly replaced by anxiety. He was taking a risk by involving someone else, but he couldn't do this alone. He needed allies, and he needed them fast. The rest of the day passed in a blur, with Julian barely able to focus on his work. Every interaction felt like it could be his last. Every glance over his shoulder a reminder that his life was no longer his own. By the time his shift ended, he was exhausted, both mentally and physically. As the clock neared 8 p.m., Julian made his way to the old coffee shop, a small, dimly lit place that had been a favorite haunt during his residency. It was quiet now, with only a few patrons scattered at the tables. Julian chose a corner seat, his back to the wall, and waited. Minutes later, the door opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s walked in. His hair was cropped short, his face set in a serious expression as he scanned the room. When his eyes locked on Julian, he gave a brief nod and made his way over. "Julian," he greeted, sliding into the seat opposite. "You look like hell." Julian managed a weak smile. It's been a rough few days, David. David's gaze sharpened. What's going on? You wouldn't call me unless it was serious. Julian glanced around, making sure they weren't being overheard. It's bad, David. Really bad. I'm being blackmailed, forced to hurt my patients. I don't know who this guy is, but he's already made it clear that he's willing to kill if I don't cooperate. David's expression darkened, and he leaned in closer. Tell me everything. Over the next hour, Julian recounted the events of the past 2 days, leaving nothing out. David listened intently, his face grim. When Julian finished, David sat back, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. This is serious, Julian. Whoever this guy is, he's connected and dangerous. But you did the right thing by calling me. We'll get you through this. Julian felt a surge of hope at David's words, but it was quickly tempered by fear. What do we do now? David leaned forward, his voice low and steady. First, we need to figure out who this guy is and why he's targeting you. I'll start digging into your patient list, see if there's any connection between them. In the meantime, you need to keep playing along. Don't tip your hand, make him think you're going along with his plan. Julian nodded, though the thought of continuing this charade made his stomach turn. And then? David's eyes narrowed. Then we turn the tables on him. But we need to be smart about it. One wrong move and he'll know we're onto him. Julian swallowed hard, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. I'm trusting you, David. I don't know what else to do. David reached across the table, gripping Julian's shoulder. We'll get through this, Julian. But you have to be strong. Stay focused, stay calm. We'll find a way out. As they parted ways, Julian couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. But for the first time since this nightmare began, he had a glimmer of hope. He wasn't alone anymore, and with David by his side, he just might have a fighting chance. Chapter 4. The Unexpected Call. The next morning, Julian awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. His meeting with David had bolstered his resolve, giving him the strength to face the day ahead. He knew the path forward was fraught with danger, but at least now he had a plan. As he arrived at the hospital, Julian was careful to maintain his usual routine, making sure not to draw any undue attention. He moved through his rounds, checking on his patients, updating their charts, and offering reassurances where he could. But beneath the surface, his mind was racing, analyzing every detail, every interaction for signs of his tormentor's influence. Around midday, just as Julian was preparing to enter surgery, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, expecting a routine message, but his heart skipped a beat when he saw the caller ID, unknown number. His pulse quickened as he stepped into a quiet corridor, away from prying eyes. Taking a deep breath, he answered the call. Dr. Winters, the now familiar voice greeted him, a cold undertone of menace in every word. I trust you've had time to reflect on your situation. Julian's hand tightened around the phone. What do you want? The man chuckled softly, a sound that sent a shiver down Julian's spine. I think you know the answer to that. How is Emma Lockhart's recovery going? The mention of Emma's name made Julian's blood run cold. He had seen her that morning, her condition stable, but the thought of her being targeted made him feel sick. She's improving, Julian said carefully, choosing his words with caution. That's good, the man replied, his voice dripping with false sincerity. But I'm afraid her condition might take a turn for the worse if you don't follow my instructions. Julian's grip on the phone tightened, his mind racing. He couldn't let this man harm Emma, or anyone else for that matter. I understand, Julian said, forcing himself to sound compliant. I'll do what you ask. Excellent, the man said, satisfaction evident in his tone. Remember, Dr. Winters, I'm always watching. One misstep and it won't just be your career on the line. The call ended abruptly, leaving Julian standing alone in the corridor, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just agreed to continue down this dark path, but it was all part of the plan, or so he told himself. He had to keep the man thinking he was in control while David worked to uncover the truth. But as Julian returned to the operating room, the weight of what he was about to do settled heavily on his shoulders. Could he really go through with it? Could he continue to deceive this man long enough to save himself and his patients? And more importantly, Could he trust David to find the answers before it was too late? As Julian scrubbed in for surgery, he pushed these doubts aside. He had no choice but to trust in the plan. But deep down he knew that time was running out. The man's reach was far and wide, and every moment Julian spent playing his game, the noose tightened around his neck. Would he be able to escape before it was too late? Chapter 5. The Revelation. Julian's nerves were frayed by the time he left the hospital that evening. Every patient he saw, every name on a chart, reminded him of the precarious position he was in. He knew that his every move was being watched, and the pressure was becoming unbearable. The only thing keeping him going was the hope that David would find something, anything, that could give them an edge. As he drove through the darkened streets, Julian's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his heart leaping when he saw David's name. Pulling over to the side of the road, Julian answered quickly. "David, tell me you found something," Julian said, unable to keep the desperation out of his voice. "I have," David replied, his tone grim, "but you're not going to like it. There's a lot more going on here than we thought." Julian's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "Meet me at my office," David said. "We need to talk in person. This isn't something we can discuss over the phone." Julian agreed and hung up, anxiety gnawing at him as he drove to David's office. It was a small, unassuming building on the outskirts of the city, a place where David conducted his private investigations away from prying eyes. When Julian arrived, David was already waiting for him, the door slightly ajar. "Come in," David said, his expression as tense as Julian felt. Julian entered the office, the air thick with anticipation. David gestured for him to sit at a cluttered desk, then closed the door behind them, locking it for good measure. "All right," Julian said, trying to steady his voice. "What did you find?" David took a deep breath and sat across from Julian. "I've been digging into the patients on your list, trying to find a common thread. It wasn't easy. These people come from all walks of life, different backgrounds, no obvious connections. But then I found something that ties them all together." Julian leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "What is it?" David slid a folder across the desk. Julian opened it, his eyes scanning the pages inside. It was a collection of documents, photos, and news clippings, all seemingly unrelated. But as Julian studied them closer, he began to see the pattern. "These people, they were all involved in a case years ago," David explained. "A medical malpractice case that was buried, covered up by powerful people. They were either directly involved or had a stake in the outcome. And from what I've gathered, it wasn't just any case, it was a cover-up of something much bigger." Julian's heart pounded as he recognized a few of the names. He had heard whispers about this case during his early years as a resident, but it had been nothing more than hospital gossip, a story quickly silenced by those in power. "What happened in that case?" Julian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David's expression darkened. "The details are murky, but from what I've pieced together, it involved unethical experiments on patients. Experiments that went horribly wrong. People died, and those responsible made sure the truth never saw the light of day. They bought off the victims' families, destroyed evidence, and silenced anyone who got too close." Julian felt sick to his stomach. "And now someone is targeting those involved?" David nodded. "Exactly. Someone is out for revenge, and they're using you to get it. They know you're the one who can bring these people down, and they're manipulating you into doing their dirty work." Julian's mind raced as he tried to process everything. But why me? Why not just expose the truth themselves? David leaned back, his gaze intense. "Because they don't want justice, they want blood. They want these people to suffer, and they want you to be the one to make it happen. That way they stay in the shadows, free from suspicion, while you take the fall." Julian's hands trembled as he closed the folder. "I can't let this happen, David. I can't be part of this." David's expression softened. "I know, Julian, and that's why we need to turn the tables on them. But it won't be easy. Whoever's behind this is powerful, well-connected, and they won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who stands in their way." Julian looked at David, desperation in his eyes. "What do we do?" David paused, then said, "We need to find out who's pulling the strings. I've traced some of the threats back to a shell corporation, but I'm hitting walls. We need someone on the inside, Someone who can get us information that we can't access from the outside. Julian's thoughts raced as he considered their options. It was a risky plan, but it might be their only chance. I know someone, Julian said slowly, thinking of Emma. She's well connected, and if anyone can dig up dirt on these people, it's her. David nodded, seeing the sense in the plan. Then we need to bring her in, but carefully. The less she knows about the danger she's in, the better. We can't risk tipping off our enemy. Julian felt a surge of determination. For the first time in days, he felt like he had a real plan, a way to fight back against the forces that were threatening to destroy him. But as he and David began to plot their next steps, Julian couldn't shake the feeling that they were up against something far bigger than they realized. Something that could consume them all if they weren't careful. And time was running out. Chapter 6. The Trap. Over the next few days, Julian and David carefully orchestrated their plan. Julian maintained his facade at the hospital, continuing to perform his duties while subtly gathering information on Emma's connections. Meanwhile, David delved deeper into the murky waters of the past, trying to unearth any shred of evidence that could tie their mysterious antagonist to the crimes of years ago. The tension was unbearable. Julian knew he was walking a tightrope, with every step bringing him closer to a deadly fall. But he had no choice, he was in too deep now. Emma, unaware of the danger she was in, had agreed to meet Julian under the guise of discussing a charity event. It was the perfect cover. Emma was known for her philanthropy, and no one would suspect that they were plotting something far more dangerous. The evening of their meeting arrived, and Julian found himself standing outside a quiet cafe in one of the city's upscale neighborhoods. It was the kind of place where people met to discuss business deals or enjoy a quiet meal, far removed from the chaos that had consumed his life. As he waited for Emma, Julian couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Emma arrived a few minutes later, her smile warm and genuine as she greeted Julian. She looked radiant, her energy and compassion undimmed despite the years she had spent battling her own health issues. Julian felt a pang of guilt for dragging her into this mess, but he had no other choice. They sat at a corner table, their conversation light and casual at first. Julian kept up the pretense, talking about the charity event Emma was organizing, while subtly steering the conversation toward the connections she had in the medical and legal communities. As they talked, Julian noticed a man sitting at a nearby table, his attention seemingly focused on a newspaper. But something about the man's posture, the way his eyes occasionally flicked in their direction, set off alarm bells in Julian's mind. Could it be one of the man's operatives keeping tabs on him? Julian's heart pounded as he forced himself to remain calm. If they were being watched, he couldn't afford to tip his hand. He needed to get the information from Emma without arousing suspicion. "Emma," Julian said, lowering his voice slightly, "I've been thinking a lot about the work we're doing. You've got connections that go way back, people who know the ins and outs of the medical world. There's something I've been trying to look into, and I was wondering if you could help." Emma raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Of course, Julian. What's on your mind?" Julian hesitated for a fraction of a second, then continued, "There's an old case, something that's always bothered me. I've heard whispers about a malpractice cover-up, something that involved some pretty high-profile individuals. I don't have much to go on, but if anyone could dig up some information, I figured it would be you." Emma's expression grew serious as she considered his words. "A cover-up? That's a heavy accusation, Julian. But I trust you. If you think there's something there, I'll see what I can find out." Relief washed over Julian, but he kept his emotions in check. "Thank you, Emma. Just be careful, don't draw too much attention to it. I don't want you getting caught up in anything dangerous." Emma nodded, her eyes softening. "I appreciate your concern, Julian. I'll be discreet. But if there's something going on, it's important that we find out the truth." Julian smiled, grateful for her support. But as they finished their meal and said their goodbyes, the sense of unease only deepened. He knew that they were playing a dangerous game and the stakes were higher than ever. The next morning, Julian received a message from David. "Meet me at my office. Urgent." Julian's heart raced as he made his way to David's office, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. When he arrived, David was already waiting, his expression grim. "We've got a problem," David said without preamble. I've been digging deeper and I think I've found something. But whoever we're dealing with, they're onto us. I've been getting threats, warnings to back off." Julian's stomach twisted in knots. "What did you find?" David handed Julian a file, his face serious. "It's all in there. The connections, the money trails, the people involved. But we're running out of time. We need to make a move and we need to do it now." Julian flipped through the file, his eyes widening as he saw the names, the evidence of corruption and betrayal that had been hidden for so long. But as he read, a terrible realization began to dawn on him. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about power, about silencing anyone who threatened to expose the truth. And Julian had walked right into their trap. He looked up at David, his voice barely a whisper. "They're coming for us, aren't they?" David's eyes were filled with determination. "Yes, but we're not going down without a fight." Julian felt a surge of fear and adrenaline. They were out of options, out of time. But if they could expose the truth, if they could bring these people to justice, it would all be worth it. They had one shot, one chance to turn the tables. And they were going to take it.